right, check. Sound good? Excellent. Okay. Welcome, everybody. I saw this coming down my calendar for the last 6 weeks, and now we're here. I'm looking at you, you're looking at me. So I look forward to this talk. I'm glad I'm here on the second day. I learned a lot yesterday. When I was invited to speak 6 weeks ago, I wasn't sure how to approach this, whom I'd be speaking to, things like that. So first of all, I want to give a round of applause to everybody that spoke yesterday. Super informative. It takes a lot to get up here and speak. So, thanks to everybody, especially the first day, I thought, where you just walk in here and you're not really sure who's going to be attending. So I got a better idea today of whom I'm talking to, and hopefully this lands with everybody. I do have a disclaimer, much like Jason Berquist had yesterday for his company. My disclaimer is that I'm not representing Caltech in this speech. I'm representing my experience as an environmental planner as an employee of Caltech. So thanks to HR and the legal counsel that I had to declare that on this. But we're going to talk about some things I am doing for Caltech, which are relevant to what I'm going to talk about and some of the impacts that you folks might have in your day-to-day business operations. I wanted to start the slide with an executive summary, what I'm going to talk about, and hopefully this lands. The core challenge we've all talked about yesterday, and we're all aware of, is maintain profitable and efficient business operations while aiming to conserve critical environmental resources during development, production, manufacturing, or operations. Now, I know it's a lot, it's a broad topic, it's a broad definition, but I hope this lands, in your inbox, so to speak, as to how this directly is going to impact what you do on a daily basis, what impacts, direct and impact you have on a daily basis, and try to think maybe a little more globally and broadly about impacts you might not be recognizing on a day-to-day basis that you hopefully will see during this presentation. With that creates an opportunity, and I'm here to talk about this, with proper planning, consultation with stakeholders, we're going to talk about that a lot during this talk, and impact analysis. Businesses can identify areas to avoid, minimize, and mitigate impacts to critical environmental resources during planning, production, and operational phases of development. So again, this is going to be a broad topic about what you do on a daily basis, what your inputs are, your outputs are, direct and indirect, for what you do for a living and what your company does. I want to start with an introduction of who I am, Kevin Hostert. I was born in Chicago, Illinois. I grew up there. Illinois is a lot different than Portland or the West Coast. And I look back on kind of that, experience with a bit of gratitude, and I also am glad I live on the West Coast now and not Illinois anymore. But all my family's back in Illinois. My father's a truck driver. There's a lot of oil. There's a lot of blue-collar jobs out there. There's a lot of manufacturing. These are things we don't really think about here on the West Coast so much. We don't have a lot of oil. We don't have a lot of manufacturing in comparison, to the Midwest and some of those states. And we talked about the differences in, some states versus other states and how ESG is revered or disdained and things like that. But having that background, from being born in Illinois, I think gave me a little bit of an anchor that I don't want to say is better or worse, but it's different than what we see on the West Coast. Now, I left Chicago as a wee ute, age 10. We relocated to Seattle, Washington, just up the road, on I-5, not too far away from here. I lived there from age 10 to 30, went to the University of Washington, got a degree in conservation biology. Living in Washington is one of the most beautiful states, not only in the country, but I think on the planet. I mean, that's a perfect picture there. It really got me to appreciate nature. It guided, some of my takes and my beliefs in environmental stewardship and things like that. So I moved there about age 30 to San Francisco, where we live now. San Francisco is very similar to Seattle, just more expensive for the most part, but very similar politics. Great place to live as well. I love San Francisco. I planned on living there for 2 years and coming back to Seattle, and I'm 25 years in and I'm still in San Francisco and probably going to stay there. So I've really appreciated, my time there. There's a lot of regulatory work in California, and as a person working in the regulatory industry, there's a lot of available work. So one thing about regulatory, work is that it's very localized. You're familiar with the areas you work in, and if I were to pack up and move to, say, Tennessee, I wouldn't know a lot of things over there, a lot of the biological species and the resources and things like that. So we're going to talk a little bit about sourcing your consultants and things like that, on these projects. I attended grad school at the University of San Francisco, did a double master's, did a environmental management, and then I got a business degree because I had really no knowledge of business, and that's why I'm excited to attend this conference here and get the take of businesses and your inputs and your needs and your desires and what you're doing on a daily basis. So that gave me a bit of a broader perspective. A lot of scientists are like, ew, business, but in actuality, business pays the bills, right? So we need to perform well, and we need to be efficient, and that's where I think business and science kind of coexist. What do I do for a living? This is my experience. The purpose of what I do, I build large-scale capital infrastructure projects. So think linear projects, transmission lines, water pipelines, broadband networks. There's a transmission line, there with some solar panels. I also build energy facilities, solar and wind plants, natural gas plants, battery storage, things like that. Now, my goal isn't to actually build those. I'm not engineering them. I don't work for the power company, so to speak. My goal is avoid and mitigate during the planning, construction, and operations of these. So what I do is avoid sensitive environmental resources, archaeological, cultural resources, things like that, aquatic resources. Intel did a great speech yesterday on avoidance and mitigation for aquatic resources. I consult with the stakeholders, and we're going to talk a bit about stakeholders and their importance, both public and private, during this planning process. And then ultimately, I get approval from designated permitting agencies. They could be federal, state, or local agencies. We'll talk a bit about that as well, and how this process not only needs permission from the things I build, but how ultimately that comes into your inbox, so to speak. These are some typical project examples, again, of what I generally have done over the 25 years I've been doing this. Utility scale solar, and we're not talking rooftop solar, we're talking large areas of solar panels, 30, 40, 50 megawatts that you might see out kind of in the rural areas. Data centers, that's a hot topic right now. As you all know, AI is getting really big. To support all that AI, there's going to be a lot of data centers. And this is a bit of cause of contention where these data centers are being built. Transmission lines, those carry the energy from the utility scale solar. Pipelines, water pipelines. We all remember Keystone XL. That was a big hot potato back in the day. Ultimately, it was denied. And I generally don't do oil, but I've done some natural gas, I've done some water, things like that. These also carry resources, from where they're sourced ultimately to your water tap or the electricity or whatever that comes into this building right here. Substations, Jessica, this one's for you, I threw in there. You've probably driven by these things a million times, and you're like, what is that thing? And essentially, this is just a giant switching station where the transmission lines carry the energy from the utility scale solar into there, they drop it down, they lower the voltage, it gets redistributed again to the lights here that we're looking at, to this presentation here, to your computers. So if you don't take anything away from this, at least you know how substations work now. And you've probably driven by them a million times, and you're like, oh, that's what that guy was talking about. And then finally, utility scale battery storage is some projects I've worked on. This is a new thing. We all know the temperamental nature of renewable energy. Utility scale battery storage is going to be kind of the Band-Aid, if you will, to fix it. It's not going to be the end all, but this is something that's getting hot, not only in California. Texas is building a lot of these, and this is going to circumvent kind of the instability, if you will, of the resources that renewable energy is bringing. All right, so what do I do for Caltech? I talked about what I have built, and I have this kind of unicorn job that I work for Caltech now. We're building the world's most powerful radio telescope out in Ely, Nevada. You've probably never heard of that place. It's literally the middle of nowhere, and it's supposed to be. It's the most radio quiet valley in the country, in North America even. It's going to take up 1,650 individual dishes. That will equal one telescope. So you folks have all seen the giant ones. They're like 1/4 of a mile wide or 1/2 a mile wide or something like that. This one is going to be essentially 10 miles wide, but it's made up of a bunch of small, very telescopes, 1,650 of those. That's me standing under one right there. That's the prototype. And you can see kind of some of the background. You see some telescopes over there. So this is just the prototype site. But there's going to be 1,650 of these plopped into the ground. They will intake passively from the universe, download the data, We're going to be connected with fiber optic lines. It's going to reload into data center processing in Ely, Nevada, and the space folks will do their thing. I'm not an astronomer at all, so I mean, if you're interested in that, Google DSA 2000. But I'm here just to look at the stuff on the ground, and that's why they hired me, to kind of avoid impacts and I guess get the permits going. It requires approximately 1,500 acres of ground disturbance. However, that's over 68,000 acres, and I'll show you the footprint in a second. So that's only 2.5% total of disturbance, but it's over a very large area. Again, 12 by 9 miles approximately. It's going to be widely dispersed. One 25-foot high antenna per 30 acres. So about every acre you'll see one of these things, and then the corresponding supporting infrastructure. We have a solar panel. We get some battery storage, things like that. We designed this flexibly to avoid sensitive environmental resources. That's my job. And so I've helped the engineers and Caltech and the folks plan around these environmental resources that are on the site. So this is that oval shape is the large array. Again, it's about 12 miles in length on the vertical and about 9 miles on the width. And again, there's going to be about 1,650 antennas in that site, about every acre. And this is where we kind of get into what I do and how I'm reducing impacts for this project. There's no free lunch. You're not going to reduce impacts regardless of what you're doing. I don't care. But what you can do is you can mitigate for these impacts and reduce the impacts with proper planning. We shifted the project about 1 kilometer from the original array site to the array now. And one thing we did is reduce the impacts of the greater stage grouse. So I don't know if you've heard of that bird, but it's a big bird. A big bird. It literally is a big bird. But it's also a very sought-after bird from a permitting and environmental perspective. It was going to be listed on the endangered species list. Once you list that bird, that becomes challenging to permit projects in these areas. So that's a big species that we're trying to avoid. That's a male down there on the bottom right. And interesting thing about this bird, it's literally a disco bird. That bird on the right is the male. They have these things called the leks on the left side of the screen. You'll see those green stars, which we're avoiding. They're literal dance floors. I mean, these birds go out and they mate, in March or April. They all get together, and the males dance around, and the male with the best moves gets the action, so to speak. He gets to breed and move onward. So it's a totally interesting bird. And what we're trying to do with the placement of this array is avoid those resources. So that's just an example of a biological resource that we're going to avoid. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some other resources. Catch up on my notes. All right, if you pay attention to one slide and you take away from one slide, this is what I want everybody to pay attention to. A lot of the press, a lot of the information, a lot of things we hear about on a daily basis are greenhouse gases, reduced greenhouse gases, less greenhouse gases. And that's just but one environmental resource. Show of hands, anybody ever heard of NEPA out there? All right, got a few folks. This was essentially taken from a NEPA checklist, and not to get too into it, but NEPA is just a federal checklist of environmental impacts with the federal nexus. But all these are other things that we analyze in NEPA, and all these are other things that we should be analyzing in infrastructure projects that may direct your business either directly or indirectly. Air quality is one. Biological resources, that's something I guess I would be an expert on, if you will, at least compared to some of these other things. Tribal cultural resources, archaeological resources, some social issues, population and housing, transportation, traffic, agricultural and forestry. Noise is a big impact. Noise can affect not only stakeholders that are human, but also, as we talked about, the sage grouse and things like that, negatively reduce populations. Geology, soils, water quality, Intel, again, talked yesterday about that. Aesthetics is a huge one. This project is going to have a pretty significant impact on aesthetics because there's nothing out there right now. So that's something we're looking at. And finally, public services. Is your infrastructure that you're developing negatively impact public services, emergency services? Are you overloading schools or other impacts to societies? And yes, finally, greenhouse gases. and I don't mean to be cynical on this, but if you're just reducing greenhouse gases, but you're not doing any of these other things like conserving biological resources or aquatic, it's all for naught in my opinion, because we want to reduce greenhouse gases to ultimately, not negatively impact things like biological resources or water or things like that. So this is kind of what I focus on, big picture, all these things kind of come under greenhouse gas emissions. So that's just kind of a little bit of take of the environmental resources, but these are things like you should be analyzing big picture in addition to your daily business operations. So this, a lot of folks did this yesterday. We have our direct impacts. This is just a nice, simple illustration, I think. What's coming in when you have your operations or your business. You got your raw materials you can measure, your chemicals, your water, your energy. Then you have your business activity, that which you do every day, that which you provide, that which you produce. And then you have your exports, your solid waste, wastewater, air emissions, noise, odor, radiation. Those can be considered either direct or indirect impacts. And we had some folks talk yesterday about this, and it's really critical. Let me find my notes here. Sorry, just a second. Here we are. The reporting and the compliance is one thing. Dominique over at Salesforce had a great line. What are the outputs versus the outcome? The outputs are one thing, but let's also measure the outcome, which can be indirect impacts to some of those environmental resources that I just discussed. So, I applaud Dominique on that yesterday, talking about not only is the output important, but what is the outcome that we're measuring, and it's something to think about. From soup to nuts, so to speak, what you're starting with, what you're using, what you're outputting, what you're exporting, and then how all those exports might affect negatively or positively environmental impacts. Looking beyond the obvious, this is kind of a follow-up to that slide. We talked yesterday about the direct and the indirect impacts. I like this slide just because it's like, well, what we see on the surface is a lot less than what is actually below the surface. And what's below the surface, again, the raw materials you're using, the suppliers you're getting these raw materials from, the retailers you're selling to, the consumers, and how do the consumers treat your product or your output after they're done with it. Look at the direct and indirect impacts that you can. Indirect is also impacts to the environmental resources. And one thing I want to do is own your impacts. We talked yesterday, I think the packaging gentleman talked about it, about how we're defining certain areas of our impacts as it's related to, I guess, either legislation or reporting requirements, and we're kind of removing our other impacts because either we don't have to or we want to look better. I think companies are doing a better job, hopefully. We've had a bit of a reckoning with the ESG on owning their impacts, speaking truthfully to what those are, and analyzing that. But I think, from what I do for a living and the impacts, this never really gets to the board, so to speak, or the boardroom, things like that. So it's just something to think about as you're using resources, electricity, water, things like that. Where is this coming from? Where am I sourcing it? Am I using renewable energy? Well, that's great, but where's the renewable energy being built? Is it built in rural Nevada? Did I just blow up an entire 40,000 acres of sage-grouse habitat to build a transmission line to bring it in? So while you sit there and say we did renewable energy, again, we reduced greenhouse gases, but we also negatively impacted a lot of those other environmental resources, which I think is important to accept and reflect on. One thing we talked about, this requires executive support from the top down. A lot of folks, you have your annual report, and we've all seen the cupped hands with the soil and the little green sprout coming out, that we're all doing our part, right? But let's be real about what we're actually doing here. I feel like some of that's written by the marketing team a lot of times. I'd like to see more scientific input and what the actual impacts are. And nothing against marketing or anything like that, but a lot of the ESG in the past was box checking, is what it was. And I think that's why we had a bit of a reckoning on the ESG front, was that it was box checking, it wasn't sincere. So that's just kind of like what I recommend for all the folks in this room or anybody watching this presentation, let's take a look at not only what you're doing directly, but how all that indirect information or all those indirect impacts trickle down, so to speak. So, take a sip of water here real quick. So these are just some resources that I deal with. For example, federal government agencies. I deal with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They oversee endangered species, critical habitat, things like that. I don't deal with the EPA too much. I imagine a lot of folks in here do deal with the EPA a little bit in an indirect way if you're doing outputs of effluents to waters, things like that. I also deal with the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. So that's archaeological and tribal resources. Then we have the state agencies. I don't work a lot in Oregon. I work mostly in California, so these are Oregon examples. The Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife is a good resource. The Oregon State Historic Preservation Office, Department of Environmental Quality. Then we have your internal staff. Now, Intel did a good speech yesterday about how they talked about their internal staff. You all have resources internally. Now, how deep those resources go is probably dependent on the size of your firm, but take a look at your internal staff and they can kind of guide you and guide the executives on the actual impacts that you're having. They talk to a lot of these other agencies, the federal and the state agencies, or they might talk to, again, consulting firms, who's another resource. We've had a few consultants here. Wesley, a prologist, spoke yesterday, and then Jessica is also a consultant. So Jessica, you can speak to consulting firms. These are subject matter experts that can give you guidance on specific impacts to resources. So consulting firms vary. There's a broad topic. If I need a specific biological expert, I'll go to that specific consulting firm for that specific species. You don't just call a consulting firm, say in Arcata or Humboldt, California, to do some permitting in the Mojave Desert. They're not going to really be familiar with that species. So I recommend local consulting firms as best as you can get them. And then finally, NGOs and nonprofits. Heather over at BEF spoke yesterday. They're an NGO. They have mitigation expertise and experience with specific resource and critical mitigation lands. One thing else I will say about consulting firms, they're expensive, and they just are. So that's get your ducks in a row before you go consulting. And I do recommend looking at your internal resources who are familiar with the consulting firms before you start reaching out. And there are bad consulting firms out there who tell you everything under the moon, and they don't get it right. So vet your consultants. That's number one recommendation. NGOs and nonprofits, I love working with them because they're really excited about the resource. They're really knowledgeable about the resource. They're very responsive as well. So I really like working with NGOs. They will guide you, usually to a consultant, so you might start with the NGOs after you've spoken with your internal siting staff. The federal and state government agencies, while they're a key player, they are not responsive oftentimes, if they are responsive at all. So they can be challenging to deal with. And it's hit and miss with a lot of these folks. Sometimes you'll get a really excited bird expert on one of your projects you're analyzing, and sometimes you'll just get ghosted. So ultimately, if you're looking for resource information, you can Google the federal agency that you want to deal with, and the state agencies as well. The state agencies are a little better than the Fed. So ultimately, I recommend starting with your internal siting staff, maybe having them reach out to the NGOs and nonprofits for those resources, reaching into consulting firms, and then maybe kind of a background check on the federal government and the agencies as well. All right, this is a real basic slide of everything you want to do here, and this is everything I do when I start a project. We're going to build a major project. It's going to have a significant impact. The first thing I want to do is I want to avoid these resources. I want to move around them. I want to move over them. I don't want to impact them as much as I can. Now, we've had a few folks talk about we have various sites around the world or around the country, and it's best to have multiple sites if you can for a possibility. Also, sometimes you don't have that option. But if you can, get multiple sites, or like what we did, for example, if you can shift the site or the impact over a little bit, I highly recommend that first and foremost. Secondly, if I cannot avoid environmental resources, I will minimize those resources, and that's usually what I do during construction. As a biologist, I will minimize the impact through techniques like seasonal avoidance during periods of high biological activity. We talked about the lecking period. I may not do construction during the wet period, which is challenging in Oregon because it's always raining here, or in Seattle. It's a little easier, down in California, but a lot of permits won't allow you to construct in weather, so that's another challenge that you might have to deal with. And then finally, I think the last resort is compensatory mitigation. This is when you cannot avoid impacts to resources. Intel, again, was doing some compensatory mitigation with water, off-site cleaning, things like that. I'll buy credits for, say, sage grouse or desert tortoise for habitat credits for impacts that I can't avoid. It's expensive, it's time-consuming, it's challenging, and sometimes there might not even be habitat left. So you impact this habitat, and there's nothing left for you, to try to mitigate for. So that's kind of the order in which I approach these projects, and in the order in which your companies might want to take a look at these things as well. Okay, this one's really important. Stakeholder input. I cannot stress this one enough. We talked yesterday about stakeholder input. We all know the person blowing up our inbox, from the local Citizens Council, or maybe the Center for Biological Diversity or something. And we tend to focus, I guess, on those folks, and we oftentimes will neglect very important stakeholders. And I put two up there at the very start: the ranchers and the landowners and the American Indian tribes. Now, I build a lot of these projects out, again, in the middle of nowhere. We're using ranch lands, we're nearby to tribal reservations. And so these folks have a lot of input, but oftentimes they're not very vocal about that input until the last minute when you have a project. And so a lot of folks will kind of gloss over them or be like, oh, we haven't heard from them, everybody must be cool, when in fact it's quite the opposite. Some other ones we all familiar with: environmental groups, obviously, local residents, local businesses, we can have impacts on those. The state, federal, and permitting agencies, ultimately you're going to be dealing with those folks to get your projects approved, and local and state governments as well. And then finally, planning agencies, again, NGOs or non-NGOs, the transportation, the DOT, things like that. These are all stakeholders that you need to take into account, and that I include immediately and often in my communications. So a lot of folks might be like, well, I just reached out to the rancher, I sent them a letter, I got no response, so we're cool there. Again, reach out to these folks regularly and include them in their communications often. I recommend certified mail. I recommend knocking on their door. I got a rancher out on the DSA project. He doesn't have a cell phone, he doesn't have email. I literally have to drive out there an hour and a half in my truck, go down a dirt road, open the gate, dodge his dog, knock on the door, and be like, okay, Dennis isn't here today, I guess I'll come back tomorrow. And Dennis is, a major player in this project and has a lot of clout in this area for the project we're building on. And he has a lot of leeway into the local government. So again, identify your stakeholders and take them all very seriously. If you've done project management training, you've probably seen this graph. It's the stakeholder influence and management. The y-axis is the influence of the stakeholder. The x-axis is the interest of the stakeholder. A lot of folks might have a lot of influence and a lot of interest. Some folks might have no interest, but a lot of influence, so to speak. What I talked about earlier is we'll put some folks in that bottom left corner in the low interest and low influence, when in actuality they have a lot of high interest and high influence, but we don't find out that until later in the game. We've already made our plans, we've already submitted our planning documents, our impacts, we're ready to go. Suddenly the guy we thought, or the people we thought were in the lower left, are actually in the upper right, when we should have been incorporating them all along. So I cannot stress this enough, when it comes to stakeholders, treat them all in the upper right, in my opinion. You'll understand, I guess, as you build these things or you interact with folks, the reality of their influence, but when it comes to just starting out of the gate, I recommend taking everybody very seriously in the process. This is a final kind of wrap-up slide of everything I've been talking about. Your business, what resources am I using? Again, you're probably not building these large infrastructure projects, but you are using them. What are those infrastructure projects using for raw materials? you're using electricity, water, you're using land, you're using people, or impacting people around you. Ultimately that goes into what is my business manufacturing. And finally, this is one that a lot of folks don't think about, but you should be thinking about when you're using renewable energy. We got a new renewable energy project in Milan, and we can implement into our operations. This is so exciting. But what new construction did that renewable energy project actually impact? Did it, again, blow out a whole 100 acres of sage-grouse habitat? A lot of these transmission lines where we're building this infrastructure to bring this renewable energy that's going to Portland, Seattle, California, is impacting all that habitat out there. So again, while you are reducing your greenhouse gas emissions, you are having negative impacts on those other environmental resources, which I think is really important. All right, to conclude, am I doing good on time? Okay. Oh, well, then I'll wrap up really quick. When I did it, I was under time. So real quick, to conclude, the site selection we talked about, success starts with site selection, as seen in the DSA 2000 project, shifting location where you can. Stakeholder synergy, we talked about that. Take everybody seriously. Do not brush aside anybody or ignore anybody. Again, if stakeholders will take you seriously if you're authentic, in your delivery, I think. And if you blow them off or you dismiss them, they don't like that. And the person you thought didn't have any influence can have a lot of influence at the end of the day. Impact analysis, look beyond the obvious as we talked about, your footprints to the aquatics, the cultural and the bioresources, ensuring business of conversation add value, flexible and adaptive design, that goes with the site selection, but being able to move that site or possibly re-engineer that infrastructure is helpful and important. Having a few options on the table as you engineer these projects is really helpful because you might have to move something to the other side of the road, go to a different area, things like that. And ultimately this, hopefully, knock on wood, comes to some balanced outcomes. You got happy stakeholders, you've reduced your impacts for the resources, the local folks are happy with you, the permitting agencies, the feds, the state government are happy with you, and ultimately, you've done a good job at the end of this if you've implemented all these things. I think one thing I think we'll close with, and somebody's going to talk about ESG, 2.0 later, but we talked about ESG, what we'll call 1.0, and where it was over the last decade, maybe where it fell off a little bit. And I think it kind of became a bit of a fad in some aspects. We talk about checking the box, and we talked about the hands cupping with the little, sprout coming out of it. But I feel like that became, it became inauthentic, ESG did. And from that came contempt. And from contempt came backlash. And from backlash came the United States in 2025 as the ESG is right now. And I don't think anybody in this room needs convincing that what we're doing is right. I think, we don't need to convince the freshman over at Portland State University what we're doing is right. Or the coffee shop owner down in Portland. We need to convince the rancher out in Beaverton, Oregon. We need to convince the hotel owner down in Medford of why we should replace their HVAC system and why it's going to cost them $28,000. And when they get mad about it, listen to them. So I think if we want to maintain credibility, in this industry, and it's absolutely credible, authenticity is going to sell, and that's what I think we need to get back to from a perspective of what we do on a daily basis. And with that, I'm done.
So much, Kevin.